Thank you so much for joining everyone tonight for this event. I'm Lucy Schwarz. I'm a core faculty member here at the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program at UNC Chapel Hill. And one of the things that we do with our programming here is that a few times a semester, we bring in speakers whose work is exciting and important and of interest to a broad audience. And many of you have probably already joined some of these events in the past and are repeat customers. And our speaker tonight is Julian Savulescu. Professor Savulescu is the Uhiro Chair in Practical Ethics at the University of Oxford, where he directs the Oxford Uhiro Center for Practical Ethics and the Wellcome Center for Ethics and Humanities. He also holds visiting positions at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute and the Melbourne Law School, where he leads the Biomedical Ethics Research Group. He is also the editor of the Journal of Medical Ethics for 10 years, and he has won prizes such as the Daniel M. Wagner Award for Research Innovation. And that's just a small fraction of all the work Professor Savulescu has done and of all his distinctions. So we're very excited that he's here with us tonight to give this lecture on lessons from the pandemic, especially at this time of day. So it's 6 here, but it's actually 11 p.m. where Julian is at. So we're particularly grateful that he's staying up super late for us. Again, because I actually already got to hang out with him a little bit yesterday when he generously offered to zoom into the bioethics class I'm teaching this semester and gave my students an opportunity to ask him questions about his work on pandemic ethics and the ethics of procreation. And I know that a lot of my students are here tonight as well to get some more of your insights. So before we get started, just a little bit of logistics for those of you who haven't been at one of our events before. So our speaker is going to talk for about 40 to 50 minutes, and then we are going to have a short break, and then we're going to have another 40 minutes or so for Q&A, which I will moderate, and then we will end at 7:30. Half an hour past midnight Julian's time. And so if you have a question, you can type it in the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then I will do my best to get through as many questions as possible. And now, Julian, take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Lucy. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I understand this is a public lecture, so I'm going to try to make things as intelligible as possible. So apologies to those of you who are specialists in the area in the audience. It may be a little bit simple for you. But I'll try and say some provocative and original things as I go along. Okay, so I want to start with just what the two great ethical issues in the pandemic are. So the first issue, which remains largely unaddressed, is the value of human life and the allocation of limited life-saving resources. So this issue is behind debates around the distribution of PPE, hospital beds, ventilators, or cardiac bypass, ECMO, or vaccines. So whose life should we save when we can't save everyone's life? So I'll begin the talk by addressing that particular issue and some progress we tried to make around the example of ventilators. But the same arguments apply to the distribution of vaccines when there's a limited supply and you have to choose who will get them first. And the second great ethical issue of the pandemic is how to weigh public health or well-being against liberty or freedom. So this is the debate in questions around the justification and limits of quarantine, lockdown, including of schools, mandatory vaccination and vaccine passports. So the question here is, how much freedom should we have? And both of these great issues are ethical issues, not scientific or medical questions. So they depend on a knowledge of science and the facts to answer them, but they're not wholly determined by them. So as we'll see, the overall mortality in England and Wales was 1% during 2020. And is that figure too high? That's an ethical question, not a scientific question. So you'll all be familiar with the ventilator shortages early on in the pandemic. Around March 2020, they were particularly acute around Milan and Bergamo in northern Italy. And Marco Vigano, who I co-authored a paper with, was pilloried for suggesting that older patients shouldn't be resuscitated or admitted to hospital because of the shortages. And I'll address that issue of whether it's justified to use age as a basis for distributing limited healthcare resources. So these are the latest figures on the infection fatality rate, or the chance you have of dying if you contract COVID, which shows that the risk really takes off after the age of between 55 and 59, where it's about 0.1%, about 1 in 1,000. So if you're over 85, the risk is around 15%. And before vaccination, about 90% of people who died were over the age of 65. So this is a highly stratified disease. And indeed, half of those were over the age of 85. So essentially, COVID-19 is a disease of the elderly. It does kill people who are younger, and it does have long COVID and other morbidity, but so does influenza. What's striking about COVID is the age specificity of it. So these are some complicated graphs, but the important information is on the right, that even after vaccination, this has really only got worse. So actually, that vaccination tends to have less effect at preventing deaths of the elderly. And in the bottom right-hand corner, in Northern Ireland, even the lowest vaccinated death rate, over 50, outstrips the unvaccinated in the under 50s death rate. So vaccination has, if anything, made this distribution even worse. So the risk factors for dying from COVID, you're all familiar with now, are primarily age, but also comorbidities such as diabetes, obesity, being an ethnic minority group or lower socioeconomic status, or being a male. Now, the idea that we could use factors to treat people differently, such as age, immediately gets into objections around discrimination. So David Archard, an English bioethicist, has said that this would be sending the message that this was a cull of elderly people that was being aimed at. And some people have steadfastly refused to engage in a discussion of the value of life. And this is perhaps the most poignant quote from that. Governor Cuomo of New York said, "How much is a human life worth? I say the cost of a human life is priceless, period." Well, this may be good rhetoric and social signaling, but it's frankly nonsense. Everyone's life has a price on it. We don't spend indefinite amounts to keep people alive. And the reason for that is that it would mean that fewer people could live. So just to take a banal example, if you have $100,000 in your health budget and you have one person who has a life-threatening disease that costs $100,000 and 5 people whose diseases cost $20,000, you're faced with the choice of saving 1 person or 5. So money equals numbers. Now that might seem unfair, because if you have 5 people with a 60% chance of cure or 5 people with an 80% chance of cure, this argument says you should treat people with disease B because you expect to save 4 people rather than 3. But isn't this unfair to people with disease A? So broadly, there are 2 philosophical or ethical approaches to these kinds of questions of distributive justice. Utilitarianism, which says we should maximize the good, or in this case, health or numbers of lives saved. So we should choose the action which saves more people, or in health economic terms, which maximizes the number of quality adjusted life years. A quality adjusted life year is a year of life adjusted for its quality. And every health system uses quality adjusted life years as a basis for funding treatments or allocating resources. Now, egalitarianism is the opposite. It says we should treat people according to need equally, and that everyone ought to be treated equally. And that what each person wants is the greatest chance of the longest, best quality of life for him or her. So we should have an equal share of health resources. And this is the stated basis of many healthcare systems. But in fact, when push comes to shove, they use utilitarianism rather than egalitarianism. So these are some of the quality adjustment factors for various different conditions that enable you to estimate the quality adjusted life years. And every country has a limit on how much it will spend. So in the US, you'll spend no more than $50,000 per quality adjusted life year. So some have argued that qualities are discriminatory because they mean that people with poorer prognoses have less priority. So it's discrimination against the worst off. People with less length of life to live, so you'll save fewer years of life. So it's ageist, and people who begin with lower quality of lives, for example, with disabilities, will be of lower priority for life-saving treatments. So we decided to ask a sample of the British public what they thought of these sorts of allocation decisions. And these results mirror a similar study we did with the US public a number of years ago before the pandemic. So we asked them questions like this. There are two patients who are going to die. There's one ventilator. You have assessed them. They have a similar life expectancy and quality of life, but patient A has an 80% chance of surviving if treated, and patient B has a 10% chance of surviving. Who should get the treatment? So when we gave them a series of these different dilemmas around chance of survival, they were almost uniformly utilitarian, choosing to save the person with the better chance of surviving. So when the chance was 80% versus 10%, 93% of them wanted to save the individual with the 80% chance. It was only when their chances of survival were almost identical that a majority became egalitarian. And this again, as I said, mirrored a previous study we did of the US public. When asked about age, again, they took age into consideration, except when the ages were almost identical, 72 versus 71. Life expectancy, exactly the same results. And then frailty, which is a measure that the British invented in order to avoid discussion of age, length of life, and quality of life. But those factors are all bundled into frailty. And again, people chose the least frail individual. Even disability, people were still at least split between being egalitarian and utilitarian. Now, in the previous study we did of the US public, they were much more utilitarian. In fact, I think that they were never a majority egalitarian. And I think it's probably how we phrase the degree of disability in this study. But still, they're certainly not predominantly egalitarian. We also asked people about the issue of taking people off a ventilator if they have a poorer prognosis to make way for somebody with a better prognosis. So in this case, if patient B is already on the ventilator, it will only have a 10% chance, but if patient A is put on the ventilator and B is taken off, will have an 80% chance of surviving. Now, this is not done in medicine explicitly. Doctors are loath to take ventilators off patients to make way for better prognosis patients. But in fact, the public were very utilitarian. They would withdraw the ventilator and give it to the better prognosis person, unless the chances were very similar. We also asked them about duration of treatment, if patients needed different durations of treatment. And again, they were very egalitarian. And duration of treatment equates to the number of lives that you can save, because if you have a ventilator and one person needs it for 2 weeks and 2 other people need it for 1 week, you're faced with saving 2 lives versus 1. So the upshot of this is that the ordinary public are very utilitarian. But medicine often goes by this principle of first come, first served, which is an egalitarian principle that treats all lives as equally valuable. And indeed, the UK's distribution of vaccines was egalitarian. It treated all lives equally, so it distributed to the highest risk groups first, so those between 90 and 100 years, even though their life expectancy is very short. And egalitarianism means that poorer prognosis patients requiring long periods of treatment will be treated at the expense of patients arriving later with much better prognoses. Now, I think there's a basic requirement to save more lives. So in the famous example that John Torek, a philosopher, articulated in the I think the 70s, imagine that you're manning a sole Coast Guard boat on duty. 2 boats have overturned. There are 5 people in one life raft north, and some miles south, there's a single person. You can only rescue one. Which direction should you go? When we asked, again, a large sample of the American public, 98% of them said you should save the 5 people. But egalitarianism says you should toss a coin, because that gives every individual a 50% chance of surviving. Now, I think it's not only utilitarianism that says we should save the 5, but other moral theories, such as a theory called contractualism, which says the right thing to do is what you would want to be done from behind a veil of ignorance. If you didn't know who you were going to be in the dilemma, whether you'd be one person in the single life raft, or one of the 5 people in the other life raft, or the person rescuing. And in that case, you have rational self-interest to want the policy to be to save the 5, because that gives you a 5 in 6 chance of surviving. So it's both utilitarianism and contractualism that says we should save the greatest number, and ordinary people. So in practice, saving the greatest number means that we should save people with a higher percentage chance of surviving. And it also means that we should save those people who need the resource for shorter periods of time. So on the basis of this, we constructed an algorithm for making decisions around rationing life-saving treatment, with an obligatory stage and an optional stage. And the obligatory stage is the stage that rations or distributes resources to save the greatest number, to save those with the greatest chance of surviving or who'll need the resource the shortest period of time. And then there are a number of optional branches depending on your ethical orientation. So this is the overall algorithm, but we don't need to look at all of it. The first half of it, the yellow triangle, is the first ethical decision point. And the first triage is obligatory, that we save according to probability of survival. And age, frailty, comorbidity will affect the probability of survival. So we argue that is something that all intensive care units should do. But once you've done that and you've still got too many people that need the resource, you can move to the second stage and again concentrate on the yellow. A purely utilitarian scheme would then take into account the predicted length of life and the predicted quality of life of who you might save. But non-consequentialist or non-utilitarian theories could either be a lottery, which would be egalitarian, or could give priority to those who deserve it, such as the young or healthcare workers, or who will maximise utility, such as healthcare workers. So you've got a number of choices at this point. I'm a consequentialist. I would go straight down saving the maximum number of qualities, but many people aren't pure consequentialists. But you don't have to be a consequentialist to believe we should save the greatest number. You can also be a contractualist. Okay, so that I think is one approach to dealing with the value of life in the pandemic. And as I said, that applies also to vaccination. So the UK adopted an egalitarian approach to allocation of vaccination, which I think was wrong. Instead of starting with the 90 to 100-year-olds and then the 80 to 90-year-olds and then the 70 to 80-year-olds, they could have done what Florida did and give everyone over the age of 65 equal access. That would have saved fewer lives, but saved more younger lives. Okay, so that's the value of life. Now I want to turn to the question of freedom. Here I'm going to outline the when mandatory vaccination is justified and when it's unjustified play. Okay, so, and this goes back to a paper I wrote in 2020. In fact, I wrote the first blog on it in May. And I argued at that point that mandatory vaccination wasn't going to be justified in the pandemic and that we should pay people. And I hope I'll have time to give you the argument for why we should pay people. Now, issues of freedom and liberty in the pandemic are issues of when is state-sponsored coercion justified. And state-sponsored coercion is only justified when there's a threat of harm to other people. Harm to self is never a sufficient warrant, as John Stuart Mill said. Now, a classic example, Jessica Flanagan has the example of somebody who goes into a crowd shooting a gun into the air. We can restrain the person and remove the gun because of the risk of harm to other people. And infectious disease is just like a gun. It can go off at any time. It can kill people. We just don't see it. And this is the basis for coercion, such as lockdown, quarantine, and mandatory vaccination. And the stakes in vaccination is that time is live. The longer we take to get to herd immunity, the more people will die. And again, this was written, I think, around September, which predicted that there would be significant vaccine hesitancy. And indeed, that's what you're seeing in the US now. So, all right. So coercion is not unique in the public interest. The most kind of extreme example is conscription in war, but a more mundane example is seatbelt legislation. Seatbelts reduce the chance of death by 50%. Now, they may kill you, so-called seatbelt syndrome, but overall, the chance of them saving your life and the lives of other occupants in the car is much higher. And on that basis, they're made mandatory. And although 50% of Americans opposed them initially, 70% now believe they're justified. And some countries in the world, such as the US, but also Italy and Australia, have mandatory vaccination policies. Now, by mandatory, I don't mean compulsory, that is holding somebody down to vaccinate them against the will. I mean using some kind of cost to make it in the person's self-interest to choose to be vaccinated. So I again, drew this algorithm for when mandatory vaccination would be justified. And there are 4 steps. The first step is that the problem has to be a grave problem to public health. Secondly, there has to be a high level of confidence in vaccine safety and effectiveness. And thirdly, there has to be significant greater utility with this coercive strategy than other non-coercive strategies. And thirdly, the costs of the mandate have to be proportionate to the safety and effectiveness and magnitude of the problem. So how serious is COVID-19? Well, you know, on one reading, you might think it's extremely serious. 4 million people have died. And if you look at this graph of England and Wales for 2020, the total number of deaths in 2020 was only surpassed at the end of the First World War. Now, these only include civilian deaths, but it's only at the time of the Spanish flu pandemic were there over 600 deaths. Now, not all these deaths will be COVID deaths. Some will be non-COVID related deaths, and some deaths will be caused by lockdown. But the gross number has never been as high since 1840, except in World War I. So you might think this is terrible. Now, this is a kind of more nuanced representation of that. This is the number of population adjusted excess deaths, which is comparing the deaths to the last 5 years. But even on this count, you can see a significant blip that is greater than previous flu pandemics. And only surpassed by deaths in World War II and World War I and the Spanish influenza pandemic. However, there's other reasons to say that the COVID pandemic is not so serious. So, you know, even at the peak, the worst affected country, Belgium, which incidentally had such a high rate of COVID because they counted every death in a nursing home as a COVID death, regardless of the cause. But even Belgium only had a death rate of 0.1%. at the peak at that point in time. Now, Sweden's 2020 death rate at the peak of the number of deaths, and Sweden didn't impose lockdown, was still surpassed in 1993 and 2000. So if you look at the graph in a different way, as the number of your chance of dying adjusted for the population, 2020 was higher than previous years, but it was the same as 2003 and lower than every other year before that. So your chance of dying during 2020, all things considered, was still pretty low compared to many other years. So some might say, you know, that is not a grave enough insult. Now, again, this slide I wrote before the vaccines were developed, you know, warning that these are new vaccines, that will take time to uncover their safety profile. The trials only involved 15,000 or so people. And sure enough, what happened with the AstraZeneca is, as it was rolled out, the risk of cerebral venous thrombosis or brain clots became apparent, even though these probably occur at the rate of around 1 in a million. And likewise, myocarditis. The latest figures from the UK say it occurs in 1 in 260,000 doses, but the more robust figures, I think, from Australia show it's at a rate of around 1 in 60,000. So the vaccines do have side effects. These are other alternatives you can employ to mandatory vaccination. And these are the range of costs you can impose on people. You can withhold child benefits or childcare or school. You can impose fines like Italy, or you can lock down or quarantine people who aren't vaccinated. Now, one of the principles in public health and ethics generally is we should use the least amount of coercion that is necessary to achieve a goal. So we shouldn't unnecessarily restrict liberty. So we should aim for the least, not only the least restrictive alternative, but the alternative which is proportionate to the gravity of the problem. So I think mandatory vaccination could be justified, but under conditions of lower confidence in long-term safety. I argued in May 2020 that we should pursue incentives and payment instead of mandatory policies. There is one way in which I think a mandatory policy could be justified. So I said that the justification for coercion is where somebody represents a threat of harm. And that can be direct by infecting and killing somebody else, but it could also be indirect by becoming ill and using a limited resource like a ventilator. And that indirect kind of threat wasn't around when John Stuart Mill was writing, but I think provides a legitimate ground for coercion. And so I've argued in favour of selective restriction of liberty by age, arguing in particular that lockdowns could be applied to people over, say, the age of 55 or 65. I point out that I'm 57. Or vaccine passports could apply to people, you know, who are older. Or we could apply selective mandatory vaccination, for example, only to adults or not children, or only to those who are in the high risk categories. Now, this is based on a relevant moral characteristic, risk, the risk that you'll use the resource. And an obvious objection is that other groups are at higher risk, such as minority groups, the obese and men. Should we also selectively restrict their liberty? And I think there's an argument that age is different because we will all become old. We won't all become minority ethnic groups or change sex. So in one way, age is different to these other factors. So although I think mandatory vaccination can be justified, I don't think that the features of COVID or the vaccination program satisfy the requirements, but we can discuss that in more detail. Okay, so let me stop the show now and just briefly discuss payment for vaccination, because I think payment for vaccination is one of the under-discussed and underutilized strategies for influencing people's behaviour. No, that's the wrong one.
The danger of having different PowerPoints.
That's the danger of not shutting everything down before you start. I think that's okay, so here we go. Let's try again. Here we go. All right, so payment for vaccination. So I've argued we should think of getting vaccinated as a job, that we do have a collective moral duty of easy rescue where the cost of doing something to an individual is small, but the benefit of everyone doing that act to the collective is large. We have a collective duty of easy rescue. The problem with vaccination is that it may not be an easy rescue for those who are low risk, particularly young people. So I've argued that we should consider vaccination as being a job and pay people for the risk that they take. And I've argued similarly for payment of live organ donation, participation in risky research such as challenge studies. And in relationship to that challenge study article, these authors, including Al Roth, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, said that we could provide salary for time involvement that is adjusted to account for the amount of discomfort experienced, insurance against ex-post adverse outcomes, and ex-ante compensation for the risks that can't be compensated ex-post, that is death. So that sort of framework could be used and applied to vaccination as well as challenge studies. We require people be made aware of the risks and benefits and make a judgment about whether they're worth the payment. And we need independent assessment of risk. But the basic ethical point is that if a vaccine is judged to be safe enough to be used with payment, then it's safe enough to be used, without payment, it's safe enough to be used with payment. The payment doesn't make the vaccine riskier. And if the vaccine is considered to be too risky to be administered to the population, then it shouldn't be administered, no matter whether coercively or through incentives. So one of the objections to paying people for vaccination is that, or risk in general, is that it's coercive. It forces people to take risks against their better judgment. So Ruth Macklin, a bioethicist from New York, says the reason for holding that it's ethically inappropriate to pay patients to be research subjects is it's likely to be coercive, violating the ethical requirement that research participation should be fully voluntary. Now, coercion exists when an option which is either desired or good for an individual is removed or made very unappealing. So the standard example is a robber says your money or your life. What you want is your money and your life, and that's taken away from you. So the Australian no jab, no pay policy of withholding child benefits is coercive. That's a mandatory form of vaccination and involves coercion. However, paying people is not coercive. You're adding an option like payment without affecting the status quo. So if the person chooses that option, it's because they believe that overall their life will go better, in this case with the risk and the payment. And the gamble might not pay off, just as when you go skiing and you're killed in an avalanche, but that's life and probability. The relevant concept is exploitation, and that exists where somebody offers somebody less than a fair deal and the person only accepts because of vulnerability from background injustice. Now, there are two ways to prevent incentives being exploitative. Firstly, you can correct background injustice, and that in this case, the person will have little reason to accept the incentive. But secondly, you can pay them a fair minimum price for risk, as when we pay construction workers danger money. And so paradoxically, concerns about exploitation don't require we pay people less, they require we pay people more. And in fact, the more we pay them, the less exploitative it is. So paid vaccination is easier to justify because if a vaccine is deemed safe enough to offer on a voluntary basis, it must be safe enough to incentivise. And it may be that poorer people are more inclined to take the money and the risk, but this applies to all risky or unpleasant jobs in a market economy. And it's not necessarily exploitation as long as there's protection in place, such as a minimum wage or a fair price is paid to take on the risk. A related concept is undue influence, that because of the attractiveness of the offer, I can't make a rational decision. I can't autonomously weigh up the risks and benefits. I'm lured inexorably towards the money, and were it not for the money, I wouldn't do it. So the sort of example people have in mind when they talk about undue influence is that somebody owes Jones $1 million to take a 99.99% chance of dying in a dangerous experiment, and he focuses on the money and takes a deal which is unfair and unreasonable. And that seems to be undue influence. But if Jones's daughter is about to die without $1 million and he values her life more than his own, this decision might be both autonomous and rational. So it's very difficult to determine whether undue influence exists. And concerns about it are best addressed through minimising bias and irrational decision-making, using cooling off periods, debiasing, information reframing, and so on. So there's practical advantages to paying people to be vaccinated. The mandatory model would be difficult, expensive, and time-consuming to implement with considerable invasion of liberty. But in paying people are doing what they want to do. And a payment model could also be very cheap, considering the costs we've employed to impose lockdown. So just as one example, the UK's furlough scheme cost £60 billion, as well as an estimated 200,000 lives expected to be lost as a result of the lockdown. So you could offer people considerable money to be vaccinated. In fact, I think Ohio's vaccine lottery that paid people $1 million prize several times, I think saved about $30 million in healthcare costs. So solidarity is another objection that people give around altruism. I won't dwell on this, but altruism is fine when it exists, but in reality, people's altruism is limited, and many countries claiming to have altruistic blood donation schemes, in fact, import blood products from paid donors in the US. And in fact, if you pay people, they can altruistically give the money back to the NHS or some other charity if they believe that they should act altruistically. So payment can not only be in cash, it can be in kind under conditions of lockdown with greater freedom to travel, work or socialise and not wear masks. So to my mind, mandatory vaccination could be employed for the elderly, and payment would be better for younger people who stand to gain much less from the vaccine than do elderly people. So, I mean, these aren't the final words on these debates, but what I've tried to show is that both in value of life and weighing freedom versus of public health, there are complicated values and reasonable disagreement. And we need, I think, an explicit way of arriving at these answers, such as the algorithms that I provided, and a way of approaching the steps of those algorithms. Or else we have platitudes like every life is priceless or everyone must be treated equally, which actually never happens. And so we're left with the personal decision-making of doctors or bureaucrats or government behind a sort of veil of ignorance, you might say. So let me finish there and we can have a break and then you can ask me some questions.
So let's get started. We got a lot of questions here. I'll try to get through as many as possible. And one of our first questions is, so you were talking about the policies in the UK a little bit and a little bit about the policies here in the United States. And one question's about, what are you thinking about how the pandemic was handled in China and Chinese policy and practices regarding the pandemic?
Well, it's very difficult to know what actually was done in China. So I have to confess quite a bit of ignorance. Ostensibly, they appeared to be much more effective at controlling the virus with very severe lockdown. So although in general I'm anti-lockdown, and I think that Sweden, has pursued, the kind of most balanced course in Europe. Initially, early on, I think hard, severe lockdown and quarantine, really does a lot of good. And I think Western countries took too long to introduce lockdown and did it too weakly, and then it went on for too long. So China seemed to have that kind of principle of early severe restriction right. They also got the vaccine distribution right. I spoke to a colleague in China and he said, yeah, they weren't vaccinating the elderly at all. They were vaccinating working age people because, they were they were going to be more productive, and they judged their lives to be more worth saving. So I thought that was interesting, and although I'm not sure that's actually the right approach, it is, I think, an interesting counterpoint to the Western approach of prioritising the very oldest. So, I think we can learn a lot from other countries and how they've done things. Learn from China or Sweden or Vietnam. Vietnam, for a long period of time, had no COVID at all. They were able to contain it. So, I don't really know enough about the facts, but I wouldn't be quick to jump to say, they were monstrous, infringers of human rights. I mean, I remember I actually had COVID in February 2020, because I was skiing in St. Anton in Austria, and everyone got it there. And at that time, the German Prime Minister was saying, no, we must not lock down countries. We must show solidarity with our Italian counterparts, and we must keep the borders open. Those are just nonsense. Of course, once they realised they shut the borders. So I think that the kind of focus on human rights was enormously counterproductive in Europe compared to Asia, where there was a much greater focus on quickly controlling things.
Great, thank you. We have one question about the studies you did into public opinion, and that actually relates to a question that I myself have. So I'll combine those two. And that is, so you did these studies, and sort of what's the upshot of the findings for you as an ethicist? Do you feel that when you do these surveys into public opinion, and then you find out that a majority of people would distribute the ventilators this way, or have the more utilitarian judgments, do you feel like that supports the utilitarian position? Because otherwise, why are you telling us about this data, right? And then, of course, the worry is, well, the public unfortunately often gets things wrong, like the majority of US citizens approve of the death penalty. Not everyone thinks that should be our guidance in how we, create policies. And yeah, so what are you thinking here there? What is the role that these surveys play?
On the abstract, I promised to describe a method for using that, which I had to cut because we didn't have time. But I've coined this term collective reflective equilibrium in practice, which is a sort of an elaboration of John Rawls's reflective equilibrium, which for these public policy decisions involves, on the one hand, getting relevant theories, concept, principles, and norms, and then on the other hand, getting what people think, what ordinary people think. And one example of this is this kind of survey, and trying to bring these into maximum coherence. And so, what you've got here, that's why I was at pains to say, look, there are ethical theories, utilitarianism and contractualism, that support what the public think, and the public support what those two theories think. It's only egalitarianism that says we should distribute differently, and the public don't support that. So here you've got a disconnect between one particular ethical approach and what everyone actually thinks. And there's no reason to think that egalitarianism of the simple kind, Nir Eyal has been sort of picking me up on my use of egalitarianism, the sort of simple egalitarianism of equal treatment for equal need, is any more plausible than the greatest good for the greatest number, or what you would choose from behind a veil of ignorance. So, and you might call that a version of egalitarianism, that version of contractualism. So so I think that what it shows is not that that's just what we should do. There is a coherence between plausible ethical approaches and public opinion that gives you a much stronger reason. So we did this in driverless cars as well. So there was a study that showed that over 40 million preferences, that people, again, prefer to save the greatest number of people, younger versus older people, but then also law-abiding rather than law-breaking, bystanders. And so the question is, which of these, and then, women rather than men, non-obese individuals, high-status individuals. So the public have all these different preferences. So you can look at their strength but you can also look at their coherence with different ethical theories. So, for example, there's very good reason. Every ethical theory, I think, except for simple egalitarianism, the kind that Torek is proposing, supports saving the greatest number. But saving women rather than men, unless you want to run the sort of structural injustice line there isn't a good reason, on utilitarianism or contractualism to save women rather than men, or egalitarianism. So, that's not something that should figure in public policy.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We have a couple of questions about the idea of paying people to get vaccinated, and they're sort of related. So I'm going to put them on the table, and then you're probably going to give a very connected, comprehensive answer. One of them is, well, is that going to work for wealthier people? Or are we going to not catch a lot of people with that kind of method? Also, a question about how it might influence the public's view of the vaccine. Would it maybe cause a bad image of the vaccine or a good image? Also, people who are already sort of mistrustful of the vaccine, could payment really sway them? Would that really make the difference? So those are a few questions about the payment strategy.
Okay, so essentially, I don't have any ideological commitment to payment. I'm not an economist. So I don't, it's just for me as a means. If it works, we should use it. If it doesn't work, we shouldn't use it. So in fact, what I think we should do is a proper trial and then see if it increases vaccine uptake, we should use it. I just don't think there are any moral objections to it. The moral objection would be paying people too little, I think. And another moral objection would be it doesn't work, or it has bad side effects that outweigh its benefits. So those parts are partly empirical, and we need proper trials. And some recent data suggested that incentives weren't effective. Again, I think there are problems with that data, but I think it's an empirical question. So how would it work for the wealthy? Well, it wouldn't work for the wealthy. So it's not going to be a silver bullet. It's not going to influence somebody with Bill Gates to get vaccinated. But so what? There isn't a single policy that always has an effect in exactly the direction you desire for everyone. The question is, does it have enough effect to shift things? The second thing is, would it send the wrong message? Well, again, I think that depends on how you phrase the message. And insofar as I've seen incentives offered, it doesn't seem to be sending the wrong message. I think you can separate the message from the payment. But again, that's partly an empirical question. And the last thing is, won't there be some people who it doesn't shift? Yeah, of course there will be. There'll be some people, 5% of people maybe, just are going to be die in the hard anti-vaxxers that will never have a vaccine, no matter how high the costs. Nothing you can do about that, unless you want to hold them down and vaccinate them against their will. But there's maybe 15% of people who are rational anti-vaxxers. So I heard a lot of people being sort of portrayed as crazy anti-vaxxers, but sort of young people saying, well, this is a new vaccine, I want to wait and see what its safety is. And then people saying, no, it's completely safe, it's completely safe. But I was on a panel again, over a year and a half ago, before there were vaccines, with I think his name was Paul Offit, who invented the rotavirus vaccine. And I was arguing, because I was asked to for mandatory vaccination. I said to him, what do you think? Do you think it should be mandatory? I said, look, he said, I invent vaccines and I'm in favor of mandatory vaccination. But I think this is a new disease and a new vaccine. We should wait at least a year before we understand it. So there's a rational hesitancy that many people have that isn't, anti-vaccination, and paying people may shift them to decide to get it now rather than in a few months' time. So I think there is a sizable minority that could be influenced, and that might be enough to save people's lives by moving towards herd immunity quicker.
Thank you. I have a question that's related to that. So you're not in favor of having vaccine mandates for younger people, in part because you think, there are some risks to the vaccine, and it's not so important for them themselves in terms, because they're not likely to die from COVID anyways or have that serious of illness. And also, you mentioned, I think yesterday in class, that the vaccine isn't that great at preventing transmission anyways, and that would be sort of the main reason, right, for the younger people to get vaccinated. So overall, the case just doesn't look so good for having a vaccine mandate, and they're not taking up the ventilators and stuff, right? Those are the higher risk groups. And so I was wondering, since you're worried about vaccine mandates, government issued vaccine mandates for younger people, and you think that's not justified, are you at all worried about what's happening in the private sector? Because there is a lot of exclusion starting to happen of the unvaccinated. So, unless you prove that you're vaccinated, you're not allowed to certain concerts and bars and all kinds of social venues. And so, and that includes young people, right? So everyone has to show that. And of course, that's not the government doing the doing it in this case, the kind of penalty that these people are now experiencing. But from a social perspective, it might nevertheless be a concern, perhaps, if we're drifting perhaps towards this kind of two-class society.
Yeah, look, I'm sympathetic to that. So again, this will just depend on how much weight you want to give to liberty versus safety. And although I'm not a libertarian, I give quite a bit of weight to liberty. So you take the employment situation. Should employers be able to make vaccination mandatory? So you might think it's a little bit like smoking in the workplace. You might think, look, I don't smoke. I don't want to smoke. And if somebody smokes near me, it's going to, pollute my air. I'll be breathing in their smoke. So we should, protect me from their smoke. We should ban smoking in the workplace. Okay, so isn't vaccination just like banning smoking in the workplace? But smoking in the workplace is different, because there's no way I can get clean air while you also smoke. Whereas vaccination is different. I can vaccinate myself, and the vaccines are reasonably good at providing protection without requiring you to be vaccinated. Now, so that's a relevant disanalogy between the smoking and the workplace, so that you could have your cake and eat it too. That is, the people who are worried about safety can get vaccinated. The people who are more concerned with liberty can decide not to be vaccinated. Now, the problem is twofold. Firstly, some people can't be vaccinated. So that will depend on how many people in your workplace have immunosuppression or some medical reason, and whether they can be adequately protected. And secondly, immunity wanes very quickly with these vaccines. So even though I might be immune today, in 6 months' time, I might not be. And then it's just a question of how much risk are you prepared to tolerate for the sake of freedom? And my sort of leaning is towards tolerating a bit more risk than we have been. But I can see that some people will say, no, every avoidable death is a tragedy. We must restrict liberty, more. But personally, I think that we've restricted liberty too much. And the downside of that is that, the lockdowns and so on themselves have healthcare costs. And I've seen estimates that by engaging in this sort of practice, roughly half of the people who die as a result of the lockdowns rather than as of the virus. And the last thing I'll say is, we did some modelling which actually couldn't be published because of essentially censorship, because it would send the wrong message, that showed if you allowed people under the age of 50 to freely mix, this is before vaccines, you'd achieve herd immunity with levels of mortality similar to what had been sustained during the early parts of the pandemic. So acceptable levels of mortality, higher than with lockdown, but still not extraordinary. And you achieve herd immunity without vaccination by allowing younger people to mix. So I think that the longer you delay mixing of younger people, the longer the more you prolong the pandemic and the sort of levels of restriction that you need. So there is a balance between all of these factors.
Great, thank you. There are a few questions about QALYs and the data you presented. So do you have any data, if this is possible to come by, on how many excess QALYs were lost in the COVID-19 pandemic compared to previous years? And also, you showed the graph about the excess deaths, but what about excess QALYs, given that the death disproportionately affected the elderly? So would the pattern maybe change if we looked at QALYs rather than deaths?
Yeah, the pattern would change if we looked at QALYs. I don't have a figure off the top of my head. I mean, I haven't really been immersed in COVID for a few months, but I know last year the cost per QALY at the time that people were being hospitalised and needed ventilators in sort of great numbers, the amount that was being spent on a quality adjusted life year, I think I said that the figure there was $50,000 per quality adjusted life year. For a COVID life, that figure went up to something like $500,000 for quality adjusted life year. So it was astronomically high. We spent more saving lives in the quality adjusted life years of the pandemic than we do at any other time. So a disproportionate amount was spent on those. I mean, I heard a figure today that just the track and trace, if you hadn't spent money on the track and trace in the UK, which was hugely ineffective, basically, I'm not sure what difference it made, you would have added 25% to the health and social welfare budget. So that's an enormous amount of good that you would have done. So extraordinary figures were, like, extraordinary amounts of money were spent. So in my view, when the dust settles and we actually look at this coldly and analytically, we will see that the responses have been extraordinarily disproportionate and myopic. I think, I've again seen a figure that roughly half of the deaths are non-COVID related. And I think that, it's quite possible that the costs, as the cancers appear and all the chronic diseases appear as a result of this, that we'll come back and judge that the measures were highly disproportionate.
Thank you. This is a really interesting question. So regarding allocating the resources, how should the resources be allocated from an ethical perspective? And you're saying, right, you have the consequentialist perspective, and a lot of ethical theories give you the same result, that you should try to save more people, or people who have a better prognosis. And one question asked is, well, shouldn't we take into account that certain underlying health conditions that give people a worse prognosis aren't morally neutral? They could be due to injustice in society. And so basically now you're doubling down on those people who were already already the target of injustice, and that's why they even have health issues in the first place. And now, because they have these health issues, you're not giving them the ventilator either, because someone else has a better shot of recovering because they were already privileged in society. And isn't that a concern?
Yeah, that is a concern. We did another study, which I was going to try and show the data of, and I haven't gone back to look at, that examined people's attitudes to that, to whether race and background injustice should be taken into account in ventilators and vaccines. And quite surprisingly, the sort of overall gist of the results is that ordinary people thought it shouldn't be taken into account unless there's a tiebreaker situation. So you shouldn't, choose a worse prognosis patient, even if there's background injustice occurring. Now, I'm not saying that's what we should do. This is just what the people thought. But we were quite surprised. We thought, oh, people are going to be, motivated to give some weight to background injustice, as is the current ethical debate amongst academics. But in fact, the public only see it as a sort of weak tiebreaker. But again, I can present that data, which is sort of under review now. But that doesn't set the moral question that you're right. Isn't this what some people have called double jeopardy? Inflicting further unfairness on something that's already unfair. And I'm inclined to think, again, this is a question of how much weight do you give to fairness versus utility? And so, in another area, I've floated the idea of cost equivalence, which is an anti-consequentialist idea that you should get an aliquot of money that you can spend. This is a little bit like Norm Daniels's idea of a kind of insurance. You get an aliquot of money that even if you've got a poorer prognosis, that's your best prognosis that you've got, and you've got an entitlement up to a certain amount. And you might apply that sort of idea across to disadvantage and uplift people with poorer prognoses to having an equal chance, adjusting for their disadvantage. So again, the point is that there isn't a simple answer to this. It requires articulating the values and deciding, okay, how much weight are we going to put on that? How many people should die to bring that about? And that's what, although I'm not a utilitarian, I think starting off with utilitarianism is a useful approach, because if you're not doing that, more people are dying or more people are suffering than could otherwise be the case. And equality or fairness or correcting structural disadvantage might be things worth dying for, but you need to be clear about that and decide on how to weigh the values.
Great, thank you. Another question we have is, so you oppose vaccine mandates for certain groups, but what about healthcare workers? Do you think that hospital patients have a right to be cared for by vaccinated healthcare workers, and would that justify vaccination just for healthcare workers?
Yeah, I mean, so I've been involved in this debate as well, and the clearest case I think is care workers in aged care institutions, and these are often very poorly paid people who are often younger and may have had COVID in the past, and I don't think there are strong reasons for making it mandatory. I think they should be given various incentives, but I think it's, for all of these mandates should have an exclusion for people with natural immunity, because, as we said yesterday, there's no reason to treat natural immunity differently to vaccine-mediated immunity. On all the studies, it does equally as well, if not better. So, a doctor or an aged care worker who has antibodies shouldn't be required to be vaccinated, and the same with federal workers. But in the case of poorly paid, disadvantaged people, I don't think it should be mandatory. Now, should it be required of doctors? I'm less sort of settled on. And again, it depends on how much you think doctors should expose themselves to risk for the sake of their patients. So, how much should they, be exposed to risk, when PPE was short, and then how much should they be exposed themselves to vaccination risks as a part of their professional obligation, which, an aged care worker doesn't have, and they're not paid, $1 million a year. So, I'm inclined to think the arguments would be stronger for doctors than nurses, and given the risks of the vaccines compared to COVID are much, much lower, I think it probably could be justified for doctors in virtue of their special obligations to take on risks in healthcare.
Great. You're very good at answering these questions very succinctly, so we might actually get through all of them. So here's another one. Do you think that a scientist should have played more of a role in guiding COVID-19 policy, such as lockdown measures, vaccination rollout, ventilator allocations, and so forth? And also, do you think ethicists should have been consulted more, should have played more of a role in or maybe we could also turn it into a question for the future as well?
Yeah, I think I think it's terrible that ethicists weren't involved in these decisions, because, as I said, they're mainly value judgments. So the politicians kept saying, we're just following the science. So they'd get some computer model that would tell them 500,000 people will die. And so they said, we have to lock down. And so there was a lot of science. I think there could have been more and better science, and also embracing reasonable disagreement. So the reason why Sweden pursued the strategy that it did is they had Andreas Tegnell as the sort of health officer who took a different view of the science, and was a public health physician, I think. And I think that more diversity in the kind of input into the science would have been useful, rather than picking your favourite modeler and sticking to that particular model. So I don't think there was enough embracement of scientific disagreement, say for example around the infection fatality rate. But the main problem was that people didn't realise there were value judgments involved, and that couldn't be answered no matter how good the science was. And I think that's been that will pan out badly, because I think that if you haven't been explicitly maximising the right set of values when it comes to evaluating it with the values that you have, you're going to find that, actually the strategy wasn't maximising that at all. And I think that's just an absence of ethical discussion in this.
Speaking of ethical discussion, so you brought up the argument by Jessica Flanagan about where she compares being unvaccinated to just randomly shooting a gun into the air, right? Where there's lots of people around and one of the bullets coming down could just hit someone randomly. Being infected with a disease and throwing your virus around in a crowd is sort of the same thing. You could harm someone. And could you maybe go over again where because you ultimately oppose mandatory vaccines for certain groups at least, where exactly do you disagree with her or her analogy? And she also, the person who asked a question about a variant of the analogy where some people in the crowd are even wearing body armor, and nevertheless it would still be okay to prevent the person from shooting, even if lots of people in the crowd are even protected. So where exactly would you disagree with that argument?
Yeah, so shooting, a bullet in the air serves no useful point. There's nothing valuable about it. You're not pursuing anything that's good. So that's the first disanalogy, where when you're talking about restricting people's liberty, you're talking about them going to work, socializing, going to school. You're talking about them, not shooting a gun in the air, but doing something that, is worth pursuing and that we should protect. So prima facie, there's a reason to allow those things. And then the second analogy is, if you've got a 6-chambered gun, you're shooting 6 bullets, there's quite a chance you'll hit somebody. But actually, the chance that you will kill somebody from infecting them with COVID is much, much lower. And then on top of that, yes, the body armor might not be perfect, but at some point we are entitled to expose other people to risk. So take driving a car. The safest speed to drive a car is 0. The US, the maximum speed is 60 miles an hour because you make a judgment of balancing convenience, pleasure, efficiency against, carbon emissions, safety. So it's a balancing act. Now, Germany draws that differently in a more libertarian way. You can drive any speed you want on an autobahn. So they give great weight to, freedom, pleasure, and those sorts of values. But the point is, nobody says we should drive on a highway at 10 miles an hour, and that would still kill people. So, at some point, it's got to be what level of risk can you expose people to for what value of activity? And unfortunately, today everything has gone postmodern and relativistic, and everyone, wants to believe that value is in the eye of the beholder. But you can't apply that at the level of public policy, because you have to make a decision about the speed limit, and you have to say how valuable is it that people get from A to B. Not just, how much do they think it's important to themselves, and that will determine the speed limit. So, I think you need some objective valuation of the activities that you're taking on the risk for.
Thanks. Here are some speculative questions. So you advocate for certain positions that aren't quite so popular, like age-based vaccine mandates, or paying people to get vaccinated. And why do you think there is so much opposition to these? What do people get hung up on, given that you think that's the right thing to do?
Well, no, to be honest with you, I don't think anything's the right thing. I just provide arguments to help people to think about them. And I think these are interesting arguments that need to have more consideration than they have. What policy we should adopt in the end is a very complicated issue. There's also a lot of social signalling. So, you know, it's great if you're Cuomo to say, oh, every life is priceless. That sends out the signal of what a wonderful person you are. Everyone is equal. You know, we have to respect human dignity. It's pretty hard to say that, you know, some people should live and some people should die, but the reality is some people will live and some people will die. You can't have your cake and eat it too in a pandemic. You have to decide who are going to be the winners and who are going to be the losers. But most people don't want to face, they have the act submission distinction as well. They think, I can just omit to get involved in this dirty question by just not, you know, taking a provocative position or taking a position. But you can't, because that's just to leave it to chance or to whatever policy someone is proposing. So I think there's a whole bunch of psychological factors for why the possibility of practical ethics is so slim. And you know, I'm quite pessimistic about it. I don't think there's much scope for real discussion around the value of life or the value of liberty. You know, it's you know, in a sort of Twitter, you know, bite-based culture. You know, it's really going to be motivated by emotional forces and psychological biases and heuristics.
Thank you. Speaking of the unpopularity of saying that every life has a price and that life is not priceless. We have one question. So it's true that there are trade-offs that have to be made, and you have to somehow think about how to make these trade-offs. But without markets and the possibility to actually buy lives, talk of prices may perhaps not be quite the right word. So perhaps people have like a dignity, but, and of course you still have to make decisions about whom to save and whom not to save. But maybe the idea of calling that a price is not quite right. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, Jeff's in the audience, he probably knows more about this than I do, but economists put a price on life every day. You know, I think the price of a life is something around $2 million. And so when you decide, am I going to put in, you know, a new set of lights in this intersection because there have been accidents, and people calculate that they translate lives into dollars and work out whether it's cost effective to do that. So again, this is just a fantasy. You know, lives are priced every day in society, and that's just the reality. You can translate a human life, you know, into economic value, and you know that doesn't fail to respect their dignity. You know, you can still treat people, you know, respect their dignity, as well as dealing with the reality that where, you know, we've got a place in a collective that is not unending. That, you know, we're not of infinite worth. We're of limited worth compared to the people around us. So. I don't know, Jeff, if you've got anything you want to say about the price of life.
And this may or may not have been a question from Jeff.
No.
Well, but since he's not chiming in. So yeah, he's not taking the bait, but we'll see. Maybe afterwards he'll stick around and we'll take the bait. But so we're coming up close to the end of our time, but maybe in the last few minutes, I can ask a question that I know my students will find interesting, because we talked about that in class. And that is your conception of coercion. So there's a worry, right, that paying people to get vaccinated is coercive, and you address that concern and have various sophisticated responses to it. But it all depends on your conception of coercion, right? Which is that, so the way we understood it when we read your paper in class was, it's either you're taking an option away from someone, like, so here's their status quo, and then you come in and either you're removing one of their options or you're making one or more of their options worse than they were before. Either way, you're making their status quo worse. But you say, well, in the case of paying someone for a vaccine, you're really just improving one of the options they already had. Now the option is no longer just you get the vaccine, but you get the vaccine and a cash prize on top. So how would that be coercive? And I found that a lot of students were resistant to that conception of coercion, and had more the intuitions that coercion has something to do with like an imbalance of power between the parties involved, that something could be coercive even if all you're doing is make someone's options better or add options to what they already had. And I mean, yeah, there's a big philosophical literature on the topic of coercion, right? And so I was wondering, what do you think are the advantages of the way you conceptualize coercion compared to what perhaps are some of the most popular alternative philosophical ways of understanding coercion?
Well, I would just describe what you've described of an imbalance in power as exploitation. So, I mean, we're using a bad word. We're just using a different word. So what you would call coercion, I would call exploitation. And exploitation is bad, where you use an imbalance of power to get somebody to do what they don't really want to do, because it's the only option they have. So, you know, I sort of granted there was this kind of concern, but I would use the word exploitation, and you know, that is a concern, and we should correct background imbalances of power. So we should empower people to be able to say no, or we should make sure that what they're being offered really is a reasonable deal, and not one that, you know, is just at a result of an advantage and imbalance of power. So, you know, if Jeff, you know, decides to offer me $1 million a year to come and work at UNC, you know, he's got a lot of
Jeff.
power and a lot of money, and it would be very difficult for me to resist that offer. But it's not coercive, and it's not exploitative, because, you know, I'm just lucky, you know, that you know, I can get such a good offer. So yeah, I think part of philosophy is defining the terms, and you know, Nir Eyal had a question in there saying he doesn't recognize himself as an egalitarian in my description. And yeah, if we had more time, we would unpack, you know, the 10 different theories of justice and approaches and define them very carefully. I've done this very loosely, and I'm sorry for that, but it is important to define the terms carefully.
So we are coming to the end of our time, but we did actually really get through all the questions that were posed. You're very good at answering them very quickly and getting through a lot.
If you could save the chat for me, I'll have a mull through them as well. They look like
yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much again for taking the time to talk to us about pandemic ethics and enlightening us all with your insights, and staying up so late for us. I can't believe you're still going and you're so awake at this time of day. So yeah, I'm gonna clap representative for everyone who you can't see. And yeah, all attendees, please keep an eye out for announcements of future installments of our public lecture series. And hopefully we can see you at some future events.
Thanks very much. Thanks for all your questions. They're really good.